The claim that the prodigal son necessarily represents the 10 northern tribes with the older son representing Judah is not demanded by the text and must be imported into the parable. Luke 15 provides no tribal markers, no historical geography of exile, and no political allusions to Assyria or a north-south schism, while prophetic exile-return imagery may resonate secondarily in the background of Israel's scriptures, treating the parable as a rigid tribal allegory introduces inconsistencies and obscures the narrative's explicit purpose. Luke carefully frames the chapter by identifying a single precipitating dispute, table fellowship. Luke 15:2 states that tax collectors and sinners were drawing near to Jesus, while Pharisees and scribes objected that this man receives sinners and eats with them. In response to that complaint, Jesus tells 3 parables: the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the prodigal son. The shared logic of these stories must therefore be read through the lens of covenantal restoration and social inclusion within Israel, not as abstract theological illustrations detached from Jesus' immediate audience. Each parable addresses the same question: on what grounds may those who have been estranged from covenant life be welcomed back into fellowship? The sheep is lost, the coin is lost, and the son is lost. Yet in each case the emphasis falls on recovery, celebration, and communal rejoicing. Crucially, the tension in the third parable does not center on whether the prodigal may return, the father. His action settles that immediately, but on whether the older son will accept the father's restoration. This mirrors precisely the dispute of Luke 15:1-2. God's welcome is enacted by Jesus. Table fellowship, while resistance is voiced by religious elites, the Pharisees and scribes. Accordingly, the prodigal son represents covenant-estranged Israelites, those who, though covenantal, sons by origin, had become marginalized by sin, debt, stigma, or distance from temple-centered piety. The imagery of a far country functions covenantally rather than tribally. It signals alienation from the father's household and resources, not a cartographic reference to Assyrian exile. This category plausibly includes tax collectors, public sinners, and other socially disreputable Israelites. It may also echo the experience of diaspora Israelites whose distance from Jerusalem rendered them suspect in the eyes of the religious elite. Galileans, frequently derided in Judean discourse, fit this marginal status within Luke's wider narrative. Covenant-adjacent persons like Samaritans or proselytes can be secondarily associated insofar as Luke elsewhere uses them to expose boundary policing, hypocrisy, but Luke 15 presumes sonship by origin as a covenantal status, not biological descent, and thus centers primarily on Israel. The older son, by contrast, embodies self-identified covenant faithfulness rather than true covenant fidelity. He remains in the house, boasts of obedience, and appeals to merit, yet he resents mercy, refuses reconciliation, and ultimately alienates himself from the Father's joy. This posture maps directly onto the Pharisees and scribes who, confident in their Torah observance, objected to Jesus' restoration of marginalized Israelites. The parable's sting lies here. One may claim covenant loyalty and yet oppose the Lord's redemptive purpose. The story pointedly ends without resolving the older son's response, leaving the indictment open and directed at Jesus' critics. Thus, the parable is not a lesson about Gentile inclusion, Adamic fall, a post-resurrection mission to the nations, or to the 10 northern tribes. It is a covenant lawsuit in narrative form, exposing the hypocrisy of Israel's elite gatekeepers at a moment of restoration. God's acceptance is decisive, The question is whether Israel's leaders will accept God's acceptance. Reading Luke 15 through this dispute preserves audience relevance, honours the narrative flow, and avoids importing tribal schemata that the text neither requires nor sustains. Scholarly citations with relevant quotes. Joel B. Green opines, "The parables of Luke 15 are united by their response to the complaint in 15, and thus must be interpreted with that dispute firmly in view. The issue is not the possibility of repentance, but the propriety of welcoming the repentant." Source: Green, The Gospel of Luke, New International Commentary on the New Testament, Edmonds, 1997, pages 568 to 571. Kenneth E. Bailey says, "The elder son represents the religious leadership who are unable to accept the gracious restoration of the repentant. The parable's climax is not the return of the prodigal, but the elder brother's refusal to rejoice." Source: Bailey, Poet and Peasant, and Through Peasant Eyes, Eerdmans, 1980, pages 181 to 186. Distinguished scholar N. T. Wright says, "Jesus' table fellowship was not an abstract symbol of universal grace. It was a concrete enactment of Israel's restoration, and the parables function as sharp critiques of those who resist that restoration." Source: Wright, Jesus and the Victory of God, Fortress, 1996, pages 126 to 131. Craig L. Blomberg says, "Allegorizing the parables beyond their narrative cues risks missing their primary thrust. Luke 15 focuses on restoration and rejoicing within Israel rather than on schematic historical correspondences." Source: Interpreting the Parables, IVP Academic, 2012, pages 220 to 224. E. P. Sanders notes that disputes over table fellowship and purity were central to defining group boundaries in first-century Judaism. Jesus' practice challenged prevailing assumptions about who could be restored and on what terms. Source: Sanders, Judaism, Practice and Belief, SCM Press, 1992, pages 174 to 178. In summary, the 10 northern tribes are not necessarily demanded by the text. That concept has to be read into the story, and there are inconsistencies with that interpretation which creates problems. However, in Luke 15, Jesus tells 3 parables in response to a single complaint. This man receives sinners and eats with them. The issue is table fellowship, covenantal acceptance within Israel. The issue is, on what grounds may covenant outsiders be welcomed back into Israel's fellowship? Everything in Luke 15 must be read through that dispute, including the prodigal son parable. The story of the prodigal son illustrates how the religious elites, symbolized as the faithful son, wouldn't accept those of Israel who were estranged or marginalized. The prodigal, representing Galileans, Samaritans, and diaspora, Israelites, and to some degree, proselytes, even though the God accepted them. This view is fully consistent with and supportive of the covenantal inclusion model of IO. It quietly but decisively undermines bloodline-only IO by showing it is not textually required. The argument succeeds not by attacking bloodline-only IO directly, but by making it unnecessary. For example, bloodline-only IO needs the prodigal to be Ephraim and the elder son to be Judah to be structural necessities of the text. This presentation directly states that this mapping is not demanded by the parable and must be imported. That single move is fatal to bloodline-only IO, because if the mapping is optional rather than required, then bloodline-only IO becomes a speculative overlay instead of a textual conclusion. Bloodline-only IO assumes sonship as a permanent biological ontology. If you're born Israelite, you are a son in essence. But this presentation's analysis treats sonship as a covenantal status, enacted and contested within history. The prodigal remains a son while estranged. The elder son alienates himself while remaining in the house. That dynamic cannot be explained by bloodline ontology, but it fits covenantal logic perfectly. This alone makes the bloodline-only IO reading of the story untenable. Perhaps most threatening to bloodline-only IO is that this analysis keeps the story Israel-only while rejecting racial essentialism. It shows that the parable is not about Gentiles, it is not universalist, and yet it does not hard-code biological descent as the decisive factor. That proves bloodline-only IO is not necessary to preserve Israel-only interpretation. Once that is shown, bloodline-only IO loses its claim to being the consistent or faithful option.